Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture for land protection. I thought it might be helpful to give a little context about the history of land protection, particularly in the U.S., and just to kick off the course with that background info. So look forward to this class with you all and lectures to come. So before the 19th century, land conservation efforts were present, but far less formalized than they are now. Even the notion of owning land varied, of course, across the globe. A few examples that give us a sense of early beginnings of land conservation are the sacred groves that were in India and Africa. In a lot of cultures, there were certain forests or groves that were considered sacred. They were protected by religious or cultural practices. Those areas were often left undisturbed. They were believed to be the dwelling places of deities or spirits, and so these groves were set aside for religious reasons. In Europe, we had examples of royal hunting reserves. So in medieval Europe, kings and nobles often designated large tracts of forest as royal hunting grounds, places where wildlife and forests were protected from deforestation and exploitation. Examples of sustainability being incorporated into cultural practices are present across the globe as well. So an example of that is the terraced farming that we saw in Asia and South America. Ancient civilizations like the Incas in South America and other cultures in Asia developed terraced farming as a technique for soil and water conservation. These farming practices help to prevent erosion and maintain agricultural productivity. And then, of course, we have many examples of how indigenous ecological practices were based in conservation as well. Indigenous people around the world practiced everything from forms of rotation farming and shifting cultivation to also hunting practices and nomadic lifestyles that took into account not overexploiting the natural world, allowing the land to regenerate naturally after periods of use. So some of these early conservation practices, not always explicitly aimed at environmental protection, but they did contribute to sustainable use and preservation of natural resources. But really the birth of conservation in the US came through a movement with the Transcendentalists. And Transcendentalism emphasized the inherent goodness of people and nature, the importance of intuition, of a reason, the value of an individual's spiritual and moral development. It was a relatively short-lived movement, but it had a lasting impact on American literature, philosophy, and social reform. It spoke of nature in a quasi-religious sense, a place to commune with God and with oneself, a place to refresh and renew the soul. And some of our transcendentalists we'll talk about today include Muir, Emerson, and Thoreau. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American essayist. He was a philosopher and a poet. He became a central figure in the Transcendentalist movement. He was born in Boston and attended Harvard. He later became a Unitarian minister. He ended up leaving the ministry to pursue a career in writing and public speaking. So Emerson's works include Nature, another essay called Self-Reliance, both of these essays, he emphasized in the individuality and self-reliance. He emphasized a deep connection with nature, and his writings and philosophies were extremely influential across a broad spectrum of the population. So he alone was able to influence American thought and literature. He believed in inherent goodness of people and in the divine nature of the universe. That really resonated with a broad audience at that time. He's one of the leading figures, and it is his essay Nature was considered one of the most important for influencing transcendentalist thought. There are other key figures that were influenced by him, including Henry David Thoreau. I'm sure many of you have either read or heard about Thoreau's work, and like Walden. Another influential figure around the same time was John Muir. John Muir was also influenced by the Transcendentalist movement. He was a Scottish-American naturalist, author, and an early advocate for the preservation of wilderness in the United States. Muir is known as the father of national parks, and it really was his deep love of nature, which is evident in his writings, that inspired early conservation efforts. He co-founded one of the oldest environmental organizations in the U.S., the Sierra Club, in 1892, and the Sierra Club is still an active organization today. He played a critical role in the establishment of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks, advocating for their protection. And his philosophy emphasized, again, the spiritual intrinsic values of nature. He really laid some of the groundwork for the modern conservation policies and for the National Park System's mission. He was a close personal friend of Teddy Roosevelt. Another prominent figure that was around just slightly after the time of Muir was Gifford Pinchot. And Gifford Pinchot was a forester, an American forester from a relatively wealthy family. He is widely regarded as the father of American forestry. He studied forestry in Europe and became one of the first professionally trained foresters in the United States. Pinchot was appointed the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 by Theodore Roosevelt, where he advocated for the sustainable use and management of national forest. His philosophy emphasized the greatest good for the greatest number. He was very preoccupied and trained in thinking about saving natural resources for future generations. At that time, our country had what was regarded as an inexhaustible amount of virgin natural resources that they had been quickly taking advantage of to grow the economy of the relatively new nation. Pinchot also ended up serving as governor of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania was the first state to have their own state forestry commission. A few more notes on Pinchot's philosophy and training. Really emphasized the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. This influenced and still influences today the multiple use concept of the U.S. Forest Service and our forest lands across the U.S. His philosophy stressed equality between today's needs and those of the future, but at the same time, he wasn't actually a huge proponent of preservation for preservation's sake, or necessarily the intrinsic values of nature. So his philosophy diverged quite a bit from that of the transcendentalists that really were ascribing more spiritual value and intrinsic value to the natural world. So these folks that we've talked about so far almost all had some relationship with Teddy Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt's conservation ethic really fundamentally transformed American environmental policy when he was president. So during his presidency, Roosevelt championed the conservation of natural resources, the establishment and legacy of stewardship of those resources. He vastly expanded the national park system. He created the U.S. Forest Service, and he signed into law the Antiquities Act that empowered the president to designate national monuments. Roosevelt's commitment to conservation was driven by his belief in the importance of preserving the nation's natural beauty and the resources for future generations. He seems to have walked a middle line between the transcendentalist and Pinchot, the resource conservationist. He believed in preserving really some of those most beautiful places and the intrinsic value of those places. So those efforts that took place under Roosevelt significantly increased protected lands, fee ownership, and management of protected lands. During his tenure, he was able to place about 170 million acres, mostly in the West, into protected status. It is interesting, and have been reading a book on Teddy Roosevelt's childhood, and just to reflect on the significance of really a childhood spent outdoors. It is thought that his childhood outdoors as a burgeoning naturalist and hunter very much influenced his philosophies as an adult. So he was born in 1858. He was a frail child. He was often ill. He had what we know now today is asthma, but at that time it went relatively undiagnosed. He ended up seeking solace in the natural world. His father encouraged that love of nature and outdoor activities and really helped to foster a deep connection with wildlife and with wilderness. These early experiences really sparked a lifelong passion for conservation. So as an adult, Roosevelt had a strong affinity for the outdoors, and that evolved into a commitment of protecting natural landscapes and resources. Aldo Leopold was a very influential thinker in this time, and as we saw sort of the two schools of thought, Leopold was an early forester for the U.S. Forest Service, but also is regarded as one of the fathers of modern ecology. So in his own work in wildlife management and land ethics, he helped to move our philosophy into a place where we saw humans as part of the ecosystem and really started to understand the interconnectedness of the natural world. He was educated in the Pinchot tradition, but later really embraced a broader resource conservation ethic. He developed a very close and profound connection with nature, and he's best known for his book, A Sand County Almanac, that was published in 1949. And this book articulated his philosophy of a land ethic, and that land ethic emphasizes the interdependence of humans and the natural world. So his ideas had a huge influence on the modern environmental thought and movement. It advocated for sustainable land stewardship and ethical responsibility and care of the environment. There are many people that we could focus on in this lecture that were pivotal in the 18th and 19th century in sort of kicking off the land conservation movement. One of those people was a woman named Rosalie Edge. Rosalie founded the Emergency Conservation Committee in 1929. This was a successful advocacy group that helped with the establishment of natural parks and wildlife refuge. She was a lover of birds and helped create the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania in 1934, which was the world's first refuge for birds of prey. She was an early American conservationist, a suffragist, and became a leading advocate for bird preservation and environmental activism. Another important figure whose story is often not told is George Washington Carver. Carver was known for his work in sustainable agriculture and soil conservation, and thus he's helped to influence another one of our agencies that's engaged in land conservation, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Even though he is more widely recognized for his contributions to science, agricultural science, and crop rotation, his thinking has influenced conservation more broadly. He was an inventor renowned for his innovative work in sustainable agriculture. Carver was born into slavery. He was able to pursue higher education and became a prominent educator at Tuskegee Institute. He developed crop rotation techniques and promoted alternative crops like peanuts and sweet potatoes to improve soil health and economic stability for farmers. His research led to hundreds of products derived from these crops, including foods and industrial goods. His work really significantly advanced sustainable farming practices, and he makes him a pivotal figure in environmental conservation and agricultural development. One of the things we'll talk a lot about in this class is the importance of the collaboration between private groups and agency staff and partners. And so that public-private relationship really was here from the very start. One of the earliest conservation organizations and nonprofit organizations supporting conservation in the U.S. was the Boone and Crockett Club. It was an American nonprofit that advocated for fair hunting practices in support of habitat conservation. It's North America's oldest wildlife habitat conservation organization. It was founded in 1887 by Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell. The club was named in honor of hunter heroes of the day, Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. And the club's founders viewed pioneering as pioneering men who hunted extensively in the American frontier. In addition to authoring a famous fair chase statement in hunter ethics, the club worked for the expansion of the Yellowstone National Park and the establishment of the American conservation in general. The club and its members were responsible for the commercial market, elimination of commercial market hunting, the creation of the national park, national forest system, and the National Wildlife Refuge System. Of course, along with the establishment of national agencies charged with ownership and stewardship of conservation lands, we saw at the same time the establishment of state agencies charged with similar tasks. The first state forest service in the U.S. was established in Pennsylvania in 1895. That Pennsylvania Forest Commission was, as it was initially called, was created to address concerns about deforestation and management of the state's forest resources. So this was a pioneering effort. It set a precedent for other states to develop their own forest management agencies. Pennsylvania's program aided in forest conservation. They worked to restore timber resources and prevent soil erosion. They helped to lay the groundwork for modern state and national Forest Service practices. The first state park in the U.S. was Niagara Falls State Park in 1885 in New York. That park was created to preserve the natural beauty of Niagara Falls and its surrounding landscape. And then the first wildlife agency was established in Massachusetts in 1862. It initially focused on agricultural interests, but the board played a key role in wildlife conservation efforts as well. In the mid-20th century, we saw further expansion and modernization of the conservation movement. After World War II, there was an expansion of national parks. The U.S. government doubled down and expanded its commitment to conservation. Around 1964, we had the Wilderness Act that helped to establish a legal framework for preserving undeveloped wilderness areas. It was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, and it helped to create the National Wilderness Preservation System of designating specific lands as wilderness to be protected and managed in their natural state. That act prohibited commercial activities, motorized vehicle, infrastructure development within these areas, and really ensured that they remained in a pristine and unspoiled condition for future generations. The Wilderness Act has, at this point, been instrumental in safeguarding 110 million acres of wilderness across the country. There are other prominent figures that help to influence the thinking about conservation at the time, and someone that you're probably all familiar with, of course, is Rachel Carson and the profound impact that she had in the environmental movement and helping to grow public awareness about threats, pervasive threats to natural systems. So, of course, Rachel produced Silent Spring in 1962. It had a profound impact on land conservation and environmental awareness. And as you likely know, the book exposed the dangers of widespread pesticide use, particularly DDT, and the harmful effects that had on wildlife and ecosystems. Carson's narrative and her connection to the natural world, mixed with the scientific evidence that she included in Silent Springs and other books, really helped to catalyze public concern and spark the broader environmental movement, along with really important legislation that happened later in the mid-20th century. I wanted to end with just a couple of other accolades for oldest conservation entities or ideas. One that many of us have never heard about is the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. It's largely regarded as the oldest conservation nonprofit organization in the U.S. It was established to conserve George Washington's estate, so it's been around for almost 200 years. It was founded in 1853 by a group of prominent women when the family needed to sell the estate. And it was established really just to preserve Mount Vernon. It was led by a South Carolina woman, Anne Pamela Cunningham, who was able to rally the support and the funds that were needed to purchase that estate. And so since that time, this nonprofit has continued to steward this property. They've added additional conservation lands to the property. And it's another example of the long and sort of sordid history that we see between private NGOs and government agencies in the stewardship of these sorts of important sites. So in this string of firsts, I wanted to go ahead and mention the first conservation easement as well. Also, something that took place in the mid-20th century in 1960. It was the American Farmland Trust was interested in facilitating a legal agreement between a landowner and the conservation organization. And the idea, the concept of a conservation easement came from a husband-wife team, Ronald and Margaret Williams. Ronald was the attorney that came up with some of the legal structure and concepts, while his wife Margaret really was an important advocate, proponent, and eventually helped to advocate for this sort of conservation to take place other places as well. And of course, by placing restrictions on the land use, the easement ensured that the land would remain undeveloped, preserving its agricultural value and its natural resources. This was thought of a really innovative approach at this time, and of course served as a first model for balancing private land ownership with conservation goals. It eventually led to the widespread adoption of conservation easements as a tool for protecting land and biodiversity across the United States. And what we know now, it was sort of the founding concept that allowed for the birth of the land trust movement.